Who lost China? Now, this will sound like a weird question, but if you had asked this question, probably from about 1948-ish on through the late 60s, this would have been a burning political question. And if you got tarred and feathered with it, you could very easily become politically neutered. Now, this was a huge, huge deal, this idea of who lost China to the establishment, but not at all to the American public. And by saying who lost China is how did the Chinese nationalists lose and the Chinese communists win? So the whole order, the neoliberal order, was not as powerful as they imagined it would be. And this would lead to an undercurrent of anti communism. Being weak in the face of communists was a devastating blow in establishment circles. China was lost due to incompetence on somebody's part. So now, instead of this great mass of land and people of China being consumers of US security and manufacturing, they were now a source of vast hordes to be used against the new neoliberal order. Korea was seen as a mixed enterprise. The whole of Korea should have been in our sphere, but the South as a permanent base on the Chinese frontier was now seen as a good way to keep troops close to China without being too antagonistic because North Korea acted as a buffer between them. Vietnam was meant to be similar in nature. Uh, the US East Coast brain trusts failed to grasp that being in control of three sides of a peninsula are very different than being in control of one side of a peninsula. Thus, our establishment was very had a very difficult time understanding why they could not duplicate in Vietnam what they had done in Korea. The Chinese question of who failed would drive four administrations deep into a Vietnam War that they didn't really want to be in, but were forced to by the weight of the neoliberal order that demanded it. Nixon's pivot to China was based on the orthodoxy of the need to undo part of the failure of the neoliberal order. Once Deng, Deng Xiaoping, committed to reform, the neoliberal order functioned on the inevitability that China would enter the neoliberal order. Similar to how the neoliberal order ignored dictatorial thuggery in small countries, they would invest in China and let it spread its influence into the neoliberal order, expecting that China would slowly liberalize as their establishment became wealthy. The primary strength of the neoliberal order was invisible to the people who were running the neoliberal order. The fact that they turned a blind eye to governments of smaller nations when they were out doing bad things, the neoliberal order saw as a defect that had to be tolerated. However, the small nations flocked to the neoliberal order for that very reason, that they were being left mostly alone. Whereas if they had joined the Soviet sphere, the Soviets demanded massive cultural changes. The neoliberal order did not. Russia attempted to, once the Soviet Union fell, that is, Russia attempted to engage the neoliberal order as a peer. They attempted to join the EU. They brought up the topic of joining NATO. No kidding. The problem was that Russia assumed that the neoliberal order had been anti Soviet, and that as they were now becoming a more liberal state, they could be part of that order as a partner. The neoliberal order tolerated no partners. They only accepted members that accepted the dominance of the US security state. Now, it's hard to say if Russia would have sincerely joined the West if it had been treated as a peer rather than a feudal fief. However, no real attempts were made to find out. The true intentions of the neoliberal order became apparent with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, without the inhibitions of a peer rival. The neoliberal kind of went on a tear. The interventions in Yugoslavia, North Africa, and the Middle East were exercises in either absolute hubris or reckless chaos, depending on what you think the goals initially were. If the goals were what were stated, then hubris. If what was achieved, then chaos. The neoliberal order may have become frayed with the Vietnam War, but the true unraveling came with Gulf War II. The absolute failures of both Afghanistan and the Iraq operations laid bare the ineptitude and impotence of the establishment. The military endeavors opened a view to ugly and repulsive side of the new world liberal order, neoliberal order. Neo and new are the same thing. An additional artifact of the fall of the Soviet Union seemed to embolden the neoliberal order to the point where they were blinded to any possibility of failure. The decision to launch Gulf War II with the purpose of remaking the Middle East coincided with the end of the reform era in China. This may not be purely coincidental. This may be a Chinese reaction to what the neoliberal order was doing. It appears that the radical shift in U.S. Middle East policy prompted a shift in Chinese policy in terms of their views of the neoliberal order. Our neoliberal order establishment was arrogant in terms of refusing to believe that they could make errors. They ignored a 20-year policy shift where China's efforts changed from integration to parallel competition and takeovers. Portions of the establishment are still slow to react to this 2 decades-old process. Despite the fact that multiple policy experts on Russia warned the establishment that the Russian enclaves in the former Soviet republics were ticking time bombs, and despite the fact that those same Russian experts warned that NATO expansion would eventually cross a red line, they were ignored. The reaction in Ukraine was predicted well in advance. Part of the establishment counted on their infallibility and invincibility, while others were riveted to an endgame where nationalist Russia would be picked apart and in place put into the neoliberal order piecemeal. Is it good or bad? Well, the neoliberal order was extremely beneficial from the US to the US and its citizens from 1946 to 1990. Uh, Through the 70s, we had a constant increase in our standard of living. We had a couple hiccups with the late 70s and early 80s, but this standard of living increase continued. Europe continues to benefit from this from the neoliberal order. However, since 1990, individuals in the U.S. have been dealing with a declining standard of living. So the neoliberal order is no longer delivering the goods. A major set piece in the order has been the U.S. Navy protecting the shipping lanes. The defenders of the neoliberal order will cite world trade as a boon for world prosperity. Yet, that may be an analog to the broken window parable. What is seen and what is unseen? Well, we see a navy and we see the free flow of goods around the world. What we don't see is how many goods might have flowed if the U.S. Navy wasn't out there so aggressively, and what we might have done with all the money that we didn't spend on this Navy. we won't know the answer to that question. A realignment to a multipolar world is neither automatically good or bad. It is down to the matter of how the order's resources are reallocated or not when the move from a world order to a multipolar order is completed. One thing can be guaranteed that certain things we're used to, some will become more expensive, some will become cheaper. There may be agricultural goods that you're used to getting year round that may not be available at all or maybe only available seasonally. So that'll be kind of a regression back to like the 70s and 60s. It'll drastically change the type of work Americans do, and it will dramatically realign the North American zone. Canada, Mexico, Central America, which obviously is not North America, but it's in sphere enough to where they're going to have major inputs on the future economic situation in a multipolar world. So ultimately, think of it as phones might be just as good as they always have been. Mangoes might become a luxury. Will the multipolar order be cheaper to maintain than the neoliberal order? That's a problem because if you recall, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union went away, not only did we not get a peace dividend, our military actually costs more now than it did during the height of the Cold War. And this is a lot of it is horrible mismanagement, but nonetheless, the cost is still there. So if we have to realign our security concerns to deal with a multipolar world rather than policing the entire sea lanes of a neoliberal world, what will it cost us in actual money? If the multipolar world ends up costing us exactly the same as the neoliberal order or more, then we will have a major loss in standard of living across the board. However, oddly, we probably will be doing a lot better than everybody else. However, if savings are to be found, if we're not sinking that much into security anymore, we could see a fairly significant increase in the standard of living that offsets some of the minor inconveniences that'll come along with some of the world not being as accessible in terms of their goods and services. So, comment below. Have you heard of the neoliberal order before? Did this help explain it a little bit? Do you agree that we're in transition away from it? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please take a look at my other titles. I go over an incredible broad range of subjects that you might find interesting. Subscribe. And of course, if you know somebody will find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.